Good afternoon. Let me reintroduce myself. My name is Johnny Kearns. Some of you were not present, or I was not present when some of you were in the process of jury selection. And I would also reintroduce at this time certain colleagues of mine, as well as Mr. Rowling, who are sitting at the council table. First of all, will be Mr. Richard Parker, sitting at the end of the table, Mr. Rowling, Mr. Powell, and Mr. Fisher, who will also be present at various times during the course of the proceedings. The procedure we're about to begin is in effect a trial. Evidence is going to be presented to you. Arguments are going to be made by counsel. Instructions of law are going to be given to you by the court. You take this information, you retire to the jury room, you deliberate, and you return a verdict to Judge Morse. Now, there are going to be two basic differences between this type of trial and the trial in the ordinary sense. First, your sentence is going to deal with not whether or not someone committed an offense, but what the appropriate punishment for an offense should be. In this case, your choice is between life imprisonment or death. And I don't want you to lose sight of what it is that we from the defense are asking you to do. We're not here asking for a lenient sentence. What we are asking you to do is to make a recommendation of a sentence that will ensure Danny Rowling is incarcerated in prison for the rest of his life. What we're asking is that you render a verdict to Judge Morse that puts Mr. Rowling in a cell. You close the door, you take the key, you lock it, and you throw the key away. That's what we're asking for. That's the basis for our mitigation. That's the end result of what we hope to accomplish by our mitigation. All we're asking you to do is to let the Almighty determine when it is appropriate for Mr. Rowling to die, rather than the state of Florida. Second, in an ordinary trial, you're interested with who. Okay? Who did this? You're under a verdict as to whether or not this person is responsible for this type of criminal activity. In this type of trial, the issue is not who, but why. Why does one human being take the life of other human beings? A cause is what we're looking for. Why would it be that one human being, in anger and rage, strikes out at 5 individuals who prior to this time had no contact with this individual whatsoever, and in rage commits acts of rage even after these individuals have deceased? So why is the focus for this trial? Why is the focus of our mitigation? And in answer to our why, the defense will be presenting 2 blocks of witnesses. The first group. First witness, Mrs. Rowling, Danny Harold Rowling's mother. Mrs. Rowling's testimony will be received via videotape. Because of her poor health, she could not appear here in court. So a taped testimony was prepared for the purposes of this proceeding, and you will have an opportunity to listen to it. And obviously, she can give you an account of the life of her son. No one in a better position to do that than the mother. Next witness is Mr. Rowling's aunt, Agnes Mitchell. Ms. Mitchell has known Danny Harold Rowling since the day he was born. Was there, present when he was born. She's in a unique position to describe the environment and family situation that Mr. Rowling was a part of. And in fact, at one time, Mr. Rowling lived at her home. Next witness, Mrs. Bernadine Holder. Now, Mrs. Holder is a neighbor of the Rowlings on Canal Street in Shreveport, Louisiana. She was a neighbor of the Rowlings for 25 years. Lived across the street. No one in a better position to be able to describe the environment in that house. Mrs. Holder. Next witness, Chuck Strozier, Mr. Rowland's first cousin. Probably the closest of his cousins, not only chronologically to him, but probably socially to him. Mr. Strozier also is in a unique position because not only is he a family member, but he is also in the same peer group as Mr. Rowling when he is growing up. Next is a woman by the name of Bunny Mills, who is a country and western singer and songwriter, who was a friend and confidant of Danny Harold Rowling's in the late 1980s. So she sees Mr. Rowling after he has gone into his adult years. And interesting observations. And last, there is an attorney named Arthur Carlisle who represented Mr. Rowling on a series of charges in the state of Mississippi and also was involved in an exchange between various members of Mr. Rowling's family. So what these witnesses will do is provide somewhat of a lifeline, a biography of Mr. Rowling from the time of his birth to his presence here in court. The second group of witnesses are psychotherapists, mental health experts. First one is Dr. Kropp, who is a psychologist here in Alachua County. Dr. Kropp works primarily now in private practice, used to be working with the VA hospital for an extensive number of years, works primarily in the area dealing with psychosexual disorders. Next, Dr. and I'm going to be going into more detail about these people in a little bit. Dr. McMahon is another person who is a psychologist here in the city of Gainesville. Dr. McMahon does quite a bit of work in the area of childhood development. She is very closely tied in with the child protection team and also with the guardian ad litem program. So her background is going to be dealing with the area of childhood experiences. And last, Dr. Robert Sadoff. Dr. Sadoff is a psychiatrist dealing primarily with forensics. When I use the term forensics with psychiatry and psychology, forensics would be the application of psychiatry or psychology to criminal justice, so forensics. He's also an instructor in psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania and is also an eminent writer in the area of psychiatry and law and also in human violence. So those will be the witnesses that the mitigation will basically be founded upon. There will be a few additional other witnesses be called by the defense, but for the most part, 95% of all of our testimony is going to come from this group right here. So, what are these witnesses going to say, and how then are they going to go back and respond to our question, what? Okay, probably the easiest way for me to start is to go through an abridged version of Danny Harold Rowling's life. Mr. Rowling is born in Shreveport, Louisiana, back in 1954, and his parents are Claudia and James Rowling. From the time of Danny's conception, there is some unexplainable animosity by his father, James Harold, towards him. While Danny's mother, Claudia, is pregnant with Danny, the father mistreats the mother in a very disarming way. He would grab her physically by the arms and literally leave his fingerprints in her arms. There's at least one account of going for the throat. This is while she's pregnant with him. Going for the throat. You can see the impressions of the hands in her throat. At one point while pregnant, he knocks her down the stairs. Obviously, this type of condition, not conducive towards healthy childhood or towards healthy babies. Mrs. Rowling leaves the father. She leaves James Harold and goes to reside with her parents, which would be Danny Harold Rowling's maternal grandparents. This begins a pattern or a course of action that will be consistent throughout Danny Harold Rowling's life. The mother will leave the father for a short period of time, and then a reconciliation will occur, and the family will be back together again. Separation, reunion. Separation, reunion. And in between the two, pretty traumatic conditions. Immediately prior to the birth of Danny, his parents reconcile. His mother goes to the hospital to deliver Danny, and while there, his father and his aunt are waiting for both the recovery of the mother and the presentation or introduction of the baby. You know how we all sit there when we have our children, we look in the window, see our child for the first time. In this case, upon the presentation of Danny, his father, first opportunity to see his son, that's not my fault. We don't need a child. The child needs to stay with his parents. We're not in a position. First words from father are rejection. It will set the tone for the relationship for the rest of their lives. A short time later, after Danny's birth, his brother or his mother becomes pregnant with his younger brother, Kevin. And I'm talking literally within a couple of months. She becomes pregnant again with his brother, Kevin. Once again, this pregnancy is no different from the first pregnancy. However, this time, the anger from the father is not solely and exclusively focused on the mother. It now becomes focused on the additional member of the family, Danny. And even as a toddler, there is testimony that at one point, the father, seeing Danny on the floor, punts him like a ball into the wall. Approximately 1 year after his brother Kevin is born, there's a move to Columbus, Georgia. Now, Columbus, Georgia is where Mr. Rowling's family was originally from. It is Mrs. Rowling's thinking that perhaps if the family relocates to Columbus, that maybe things would get better. Maybe the family will stabilize a little bit more if we leave Shreveport and move elsewhere. So the family does. They move to Columbus, Georgia. However, there is really no significant change as a result of the move. The pattern of conduct that was evident before the move is still present when they get to Columbus, Georgia. In fact, the conduct becomes even more irrational and more disheartening to the mother, till it reaches a point where Mrs. Rowling, taking a revolver, makes an unsuccessful attempt at suicide. At this time, Danny's about 4 or 5 years of age. Short time after this incident, Mrs. Rowling takes the 2 boys, leaves Columbus, and returns back to her parents' home in Shreveport, Louisiana. A short time later, Mr. Rowling returns. Once again, another reconciliation occurs, and there's a decision made that they will now spend the rest of their years living in Shreveport, Louisiana. At this point, Mr. Rowling seeks employment with the Shreveport Police Department. Mrs. Rowling also gets a job outside the home, balances her time between employment outside the home and raising her two sons. They live on Canal Street in Shreveport, Louisiana. And life on Canal Street is very turbulent. Once again, the father's conduct is consistent. Mrs. Rowling, again, has a difficult time in dealing with this type of erratic behavior. And it reaches its zenith when Mrs. Rowling just has an utter and complete physical, emotional, and mental breakdown. She just goes down. Ambulance is summoned. Mrs. Rowling is taken from the home. She will be hospitalized with psychiatric care for approximately 5 weeks. It is recounted that one of the most traumatic incidences that Danny Harold Rowling remembers out of his childhood years was watching the Indians come and take his mother away. The father's rage, as I stated before, was not solely and exclusively directed towards the mother. Danny seems to be the focus of it also, and there's clear indications that although his brother Kevin was also subject to the same type of conduct, it would appear that as Danny got older, the focus of the father's attention became Danny rather than his brother Kevin, and to a certain extent, lesser onto the mother and more onto Danny. For instance, the type of verbal conduct that the father would exhibit towards Danny would usually consist of phrases such as, "You're no good," "You're stupid," "You're a failure." These types of words first come about because at one point Danny has to repeat the 3rd grade. And instead of signs of encouragement, there is nothing but words of discouragement given to him. Also, there is never any words of praise offered by the father to his sons. And at any point where there is a comment directed towards any type of achievement made by either one of the sons, there's always a caveat, but. Also, there are never any signs of affection in this house. Mr. Rowling has a very critical attitude towards outward displays of affection, particularly towards males. It is totally inappropriate. There is also physical abuse. The evidence will show that physical abuse is usually administered by a belt, a 3-inch belt, and in some instances, a police belt. Not exactly a good symbol here if we're looking at symbols. And at least one witness will recount that these whippings will go on and on and on. The striking will occur across the stomach and the chest. At one point, there is a call from the neighbor in observing James Harold disciplining Danny Rowling on the front yard. And in her opinion, the discipline had reached such a point, such a critical point, that she became concerned literally for his life and called up the mother to say, "Hurry up and get over here before he dies." These punishments administered by the father will usually be grossly out of proportion to any perceived transgression that would warrant a discipline or punishment. Also in Danny's case, the signs of emotional and mental instability are seen quite early. There is an incident where Danny, approximately 6 or 7 years of age, is cutting up an ironing board cover. What are you doing, destroying the ironing board cover? Well, I'm killing the bugs. I'm killing the bugs. What bugs? The bugs. There are no bugs. The aunt is concerned, saying that there's something wrong here. Additionally, his third grade teacher, remember he has to repeat the third grade, his third grade teacher also counsels with the mother, saying that perhaps counseling would not hurt Danny. He seems to be an individual who has anxiety problems. He's very, very nervous, and it might affect his ability, and maybe some sort of counseling would be warranted in this particular case. There is also evidence to indicate that Mr. Rowling, all of his life, has suffered from nightmares. Even as a child, he had terrible nightmares. Additional signs of problems, mentally as well as emotionally, occurred in a very interesting incident that happens at the family. When Danny's about 15 or 16 years old, there is an altercation for some reason between he and his father. The father takes Danny outside, and literally there is a fist fight. Not so much on his part from the father. And the father, in swinging at Danny, puts his fist through a window. There's a shed in the back. Puts his fist through the shed, cuts up his hand. Mother comes out. Danny, father, run him into the house. Father goes to the hospital, Danny's in blood. Mother puts him in the bathroom and wash up. And it's obviously a turbulent time. Mother hears the water running in the bathroom for an extensive period of time and is wondering what's happening. Banging on the door, trying to say, Danny, open up. Nothing. She goes into the bathroom. And written in lipstick on the medicine cabinet window, following message to the family. I tried, but I just can't make it. 15 years old. Amazing. 15 years old. Man wrote his own epitaph. Unfortunately, help is never sought. It's a family situation. Okay, this is back in the 60s, early 60s. It's a family situation. There is also fear that maybe an admission that perhaps there is some sort of mental or emotional problems might not sit well with certain family members. So the help that is needed is never sought. Danny never completes high school. He goes up to the 10th grade. Upon reaching the age of 17, he gets permission to go into the military, join the service. He doesn't last long in the service. He receives a honorable discharge on general conditions. Basically, they find him to be too immature. The immaturity involves, at this point, picking up the use of marijuana. But he's just not going to be mature enough particularly at 17, going in to deal with the military, particularly coming out of this type of environment. Immaturity, another phrase that will be tagged on him for the rest of his life. Returning home to Shreveport after being basically a failure in the military, he is somewhat depressed. He has always been actively religious, and he seeks solace in the Pentecostal church in Shreveport, Louisiana. At this point, he thinks that, well, maybe if I have a wife, someone to love. So he goes to the Pentecostal church, and he is a very arduous religious person, and he prays to God to send him a wife. And while he is praying, a woman by the name of Ometha Holko comes by. Danny's interpretation: this is a sign from God. This is the woman sent directly by God to me to be my wife. That's his interpretation. He then courts Miss Holko. And in a very, very brief time, they are married. Well, needless to say, the marriage is not going to last very long. Problems develop, and not necessarily Miss Holko who's developing the problems. Mr. Rowling brings with him to his marriage substantial baggage of his own. A child is born from this union, and a short time after the child is born, a separation occurs for a variety of reasons, which we will be going into. Divorce ensues, and at this point, papers have to be served on Mr. Rowling to execute the divorce proceedings. Well, when the sheriff comes up to deliver the finalized divorce proceedings at the Rowling home, Danny just goes crazy. He starts running around the house, running through the house, running all around. Won't take service. Just runs, just runs. He will finally collapse. And at that point, we see another dramatic change in Mr. Rowling. Shortly after this, he goes into a deep depression, not uncommon in divorce proceedings, and stays pretty much to himself. One day, his mother, trying to see where he is, finds him missing, and he's gone. No word to anybody, he's just gone. Gets on I-20 and proceeds from Shreveport east, with the eventual destination being Columbus, Georgia. While on this little exodus, Mr. Rowling becomes involved in a series of robberies, grocery stores, Kruger grocery stores and Dixie grocery stores. He is easily apprehended, pleads guilty, and sentenced to prison. He is sentenced to prison initially in the state of Alabama. While incarcerated in Alabama, people there begin to see signs that something's not right here. And he is sent to a facility called Rice Mental Hospital for observations in the state of Alabama. Upon his release from prison in Alabama, he then proceeds back home, stays in Shreveport for a short period of time, depression, same incident, he leaves, no one knows, back out on I-20, and a short time later, there's a robbery of a grocery store, a Kruger's grocery store, outside of Jackson, Mississippi. He's arrested there. At that point, then he comes in contact with Arthur Carlisle. Once again, he pleads guilty. He is sent to a correctional facility in Mississippi, Parchment Correctional Facility. At Parchment, there is a further deterioration of Mr. Rowling's mental and physical health. He will be eventually released from that facility, and at this point, he's in his 30s, and he proceeds back to the only place he knows, Shreveport, Louisiana. The answer to why would he go back to Shreveport, Louisiana, these people will answer. He returns to the house. When he returns to Shreveport this time, he meets an individual who is a friend of his father's, a Miss Bunny Mills. Miss Mills has known Danny's father for a couple of years. Miss Mills is in the country western recording business. Mr. Rowling himself writes some little songs dealing with country western style. Danny Rowling becomes infatuated with Miss Mills, and as a result, they have a relationship. In the course of this relationship, Danny talks to Miss Mills. He tries to talk to her about the relationship he has with his father. He will sit in her apartment and cry. Why doesn't my father love me? Why has he never loved me? Why can I never do anything right? Miss Mills obviously sees that this is a problem. She can also recognize from Mr. Rowling's demeanor and conduct that this is an individual who needs some help and needs it now. She suggests to Danny that they might go down and visit mental health counselors. Oops. Danny becomes terrified. And at one point, Danny runs around the apartment complex with Miss Mills literally chasing him, trying to get him into a vehicle to get him down to the mental health center. Why? Why not go? Danny's concern is that he is terrified of repercussions, that his father knows everybody, that it will not sit well in the family if for some reason it is determined that he's not right. So he's afraid of what repercussions will occur by anyone thinking he's not mentally right. He's so far gone, he cannot recognize the need for treatment at this point. On another occasion, Ms. Mills will make an attempt to bring him to the Community Mental Health Center in Shreveport. This time successfully, she gets him to go. Unfortunately, there's a 5-hour wait. Well, his anxiety level, you wait for 5 hours, and when you finally do get in, you're probably in no condition to do anything once you're in there, which is what happens with him. He won't go. The relationship between Mr. Rowling and Miss Mills deteriorates after this. Once again, we see the term immaturity arising. Miss Mills will still stay an integral part of Mr. Rowling's life, particularly at the request of his mother. Whenever there was confrontation between Mr. Rowling and his father, and there are some problems in the house, Mrs. Claudia Rowling will call up Miss Bunny Mills to help sort them out. Remember, she knows both father and son, so Mrs. Rowling will try to rely upon her for help and assistance in the turmoil in the home. On May 18, 1990, the final confrontation occurs between Mr. Rowling and his father. There is an argument that develops between the two. As a result of that argument, Danny storms out. The father goes to his bedroom and retrieves a pistol, a gun, and proceeds to follow Danny out the door with the gun. This would not be the first time that the father has produced a pistol and made attempts at going after Danny. There will be another account given by Ms. Holder concerning a time when she acted as an intermediary when the father also produced a pistol and Danny ran to her for assistance. At any rate, the father follows Danny rolling out the door. At that time, 3 shots are fired. Mrs. Rowling is home, and her first thought is, oh my God, he's finally killed her. Father comes back into the house. A short time after that, Danny comes in through the back door, pushing the door open. And now he has a gun. There's a confrontation. Mr. Rowling is shot. The father. The son then flees. Final relationship between father and son is one of a shootout in the home. For the next 3.5 months, Mr. Rowling drifts around primarily the southeastern part of the United States, and then in August of 1990, he winds up in Gainesville for 5 days. And in Gainesville, he fulfills the expectations set for him by his father at his birth. There's an old saying, as the twig is bent, so grows the tree. And in August of 1990, the tree bears a bitter fruit in Gainesville. So this is the life of Danny Harold Rowling as told by those people who knew him the longest, who knew him the best. But to understand why, understand these factors, we have to find their significance. There's going to be a cause and effect relationship here. So to further understand our why, we have to take our causes and then get testimony from this group of people as to the effect. Let me talk a little bit now about our psychotherapists. The first one that I'm going to talk about is the last one actually on the list. That's Dr. Robert Sale. As I told you before, he's a psychiatrist from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Board certified in neurology, psychiatry, forensic psychiatry, medicine and law. Been in practice for 30 years. Is an instructor at the University of Pennsylvania. Has had other instruction assignments. Written numerous articles and 6 books in the field of psychiatry, including Violence and Responsibility, and another book called Forensic Psychiatry, a practical guide for lawyers and psychiatrists. He's literally lectured all over the world, has served as a president of the American Board of Forensic Psychiatry, and the American Academy of Psychiatry and Law. That's his background. Next person, or the next mental health expert, would be Harry Kropp. I told you before, Dr. Kropp's a psychologist here in Gainesville. He's also worked as an adjunct professor at Nova University and is also an assistant professor, or has been in the past, with the psychology department here at the University of Florida. He has 2 areas of specialty that he will bring with him. The first one I talked to you about is a psychosexual disorder. He has worked at the VA hospital dealing particularly with psychosexual disorders at the VA hospital. At one time headed up that program for them. He also currently heads a treatment program for individuals with psychosexual disorders, both here in Gainesville and in Jacksonville. He has also worked with the Child Protection Team and is a counselor and advisor to that group. The Child Protection Team is an interdisciplinary group that deals with individuals or children primarily who have been abused. They offer diagnosis and treatment plans for these individuals. So he has worked with the Child Protection Team. He's also been chairman of the Children's Mental Health Committee here in Alachua County for approximately 3 years back in the early 80s. And the last individual who's testifying as a psychotherapist is Dr. Betty McMahon. Dr. McMahon is also a clinical psychologist as well as a neuropsychologist here in Alachua County. She served, once again, as an assistant professor in psychology at the University of Florida. She's also been the clinical psychology coordinator at the University of Florida, been a past president of the Alachua County Council on Child Abuse. She's also works very, very closely with the Guardian Ad Litem program. The Guardian Ad Litem program provides guardians for children who are either abused, at risk, or in crisis at any given time. So she also does quite a bit of extensive work dealing with childhood problems. Has also got quite a background in dealing with forensic psychology. So those are the three individuals who are going to take our causes and talk about their effects. These individuals have spent in excess of 50 hours with Mr. Roll, talking to him. They've also reviewed medical records, witness depositions, conducted family interviews, reviewed mental health records, correctional records, crime scene photos, done psychological testing, reviewed old psychological, psychiatric evaluations. And of the three, each one of them brings something unique with them to offer about Mr. Rowland. In Dr. Kropp's case, we have the forensic psychiatry and violence and responsibility. In Dr. McMahon's case, we have the effects of child abuse and another particular area that I'll go into in just a little bit, dissociative disorders. And then with Dr. Kropp, we talked about the psychosexual disorders, and Dr. Sadoff, once again, with his area, dealing with violence. That's in addition to their usual area of expertise in psychiatry and psychology. So what are these people going to say? What is going to be their diagnosis? What type of conclusions did they arrive at after reviewing this testimony of these people, this, and the materials that I told you that they have reviewed? Their conclusions are that Danny Harold Rowling suffers from what is referred to as a borderline personality disorder. First of all, I need to explain personality disorders to you. Personality disorder occurs when an individual personality trait causes significant impairment to personal functioning or causes significant distress to the individual. Now, I'm not talking about a character flaw here. We're going beyond character flaw. We're talking about an emotional disorder that inhibits functioning as a normal human being. Borderline personality, and doctors are going to tell you what it is characterized by. Well, first of all, it's characterized by dramatic mood swings. Okay? Happy, sad. And it happens this quick, by the way. There is no period of transition. We're talking about turning on a dime. Elation, depression. Happy, sad. And like that, they turn. Ordinarily, individuals, we move from one mood into another mood. It takes us a transitional time period to do that. Borderline personality doesn't need that. It just happens. And as a result of this ability, well, disability, to move from one mood to the other rapidly, people who observe them find them to be insincere and shallow because they can't seem to understand how one person can be so elevated 1 second and depressed the next. It's difficult to understand and comprehend. Interesting thing about the borderline personality disorder, those people who have it have one very strong common denominator. You probably already guessed it. There are other characteristics that go with the borderline. Under stress, the borderline person will have psychotic breaks. Okay? Well, what do I mean by psychotic breaks? Breaks with reality. And Mr. Rowling has, on occasion, had this type of stress with psychotic breaks. In fact, the first person of our psychotherapists to evaluate and see Mr. Rowling will have seen him in such a state. These individuals also have inappropriate, intense anger and lack of control. They have huge feelings of rage. Rage is going to be another term that you're going to hear constantly in reference to Mr. Rowling. Rage. Obviously, that will be evident to you when you view the pictures of the crime scenes. There's a dynamic going on here. A very strong underlying dynamic going on here. And you're going to hear from these people that things may not seem to be what they appear as the purpose and motive. Obviously, with these intense feelings of anger and the mood swings that can occur on the drop of a dime, the borderline personality person is somewhat impulsive, unpredictable, and unstable. That would seem to go without saying. They're unstable in another area. They are very unstable in their social relationships with other people. They have a hard time. One of the other problems with the borderline is that they operate on extremes. Remember I told you the mood swings would be extremes? Everything they do is an extreme. They're never centered. Nothing is ever appropriate. It's either way here or way here, but never in the middle. So as a result of that, any type of relationship that they have is going to be obviously doomed, because you can't have a relationship in limited extremes. For instance, the relationship that he has with his wife, Omega. Well, obviously, you cannot be a gift of God, an angel. I mean, there's no way that this woman could possibly play that role. I mean, she can't be an angel sent directly from God. So obviously, okay, the first time that there are indications that she's not an angel sent by God, we swing to the extreme. Look. So their social relationships are literally almost impossible to sustain. You may also see a glimpse of that with the tape dealing with Bobby Lewis. Along with borderline personality disorder, there are other characteristics or traits of other personality disorders. Okay? Other personality disorders, traits of them, that will appear in Mr. Rowling's character. And I'd just like to go over a couple of those with you. The first one would be histrionic. A person who is histrionic is overly dramatic. Or to make a good lawyer would say. They tend to draw attention to themselves, usually by doing foolish things, and that's what draws attention to them. They're the type of people who will see and be somewhat conservative. They also envision themselves as victims. In their actions, they are the ones who are being the victims. Once again, their emotions are perceived as very, very shallow. People look at them and say, well, once again, I go back to the issue of being able to turn on a dime with your emotions. It's not that they don't have intense emotions, it's that people cannot read the intensity of their emotions. If you ask the borderline whether or not their emotions are genuine, real, and intense, and they'll look at you and insist that they are. And you look at them and say, where are you going? They're difficult for the average person to see and comprehend. They're quick to form friendships. Once again, with our relationships, they're quick to form them or start them, okay? But they're never able to sustain them. Once again, because of the demands for reassurance. There's a tremendous amount of insecurity in this characteristic of the histrionic. We're going to talk about insecurity in a second. when we talk about another area. Narcissistic personality disorder. And I'm not talking about a person who's narcissistic. Remember? I'm talking about a personality disorder that literally causes alterations in our conduct or causes distress. So I'm not talking about a little character flaw. People who have narcissistic personality disorder, people who need constant attention, probably because they never had any. They're people who will set unrealistic goals for themselves and then obviously fail. So there's a reinforcement of failure. Another important part is they lack empathy. By empathy, I mean ability to understand and appreciate other people's feelings. That's not that they don't want to have empathy. They simply don't know how to have empathy. We're going to be once again seeing the term empathy show up. They also are very craving of admiration because of certain inferiority feelings that they have. They feel they lack worth. Lack worth. Another term we're going to see in just a few minutes. We start time and mitigation altogether. There are a number of other personality disorders that encompass Mr. Rowling's psychological makeup. Antisocial, obsessive-compulsive, and in fact, if one was to take out the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual on Mental Disorders, D.D. Harold Rowling would probably hit just about all of the personality disorders contained in that volume. All three doctors are going to tell you that the personality disorders, the borderline, is severe in him, very severe. That it affects how he thinks, how he acts, how he rationalizes, how he socializes. They will also attest to the fact of its connection with his immaturity socially, sexually, psychologically, and other aspects of his personality. He's a very immature person. Let me move on to another area we'll talk about. Paraphilia, voyeurism. This testimony will primarily come from Dr. Prout, but you will also see it from some of the other psychotherapists. Danny Harold Rowling has a psychosexual disorder. He's voyeuristic. Once again, when I'm talking about this as a psychological problem, this goes beyond peeping in windows, okay? I mean, we're talking about something that permeates an individual's person, okay, and has a certain control over them. Voyeurism is characterized by repetitively looking at unsuspecting people in a state of disrobing. I need to talk to you a little bit about how this voyeurism began with Mr. Rowling, because we go back again to his youth. It's going to occur when he's about 15 or 16 years old. He encounters another individual approximately the same age in Shreveport, and this individual introduces him into looking into windows. Well, obviously we all know that voyeurism has a sexual basis or foundation to it. In Mr. Rowling's case, that's not how it starts off. Granted, that's eventually how it winds up, but that's not how it starts off. The primary motivation or purpose for the peeking for him to start with deals with the fact that he would get up early in the morning, hours before anybody else in the house. Made no difference whatsoever what type of climate it was. Could have been raining, could have been snowing, could have been freezing outside. Didn't make any difference. And he would go out, and he would sit, and he would watch people getting up in the morning. Watch them get up. Watch them go to the rest facilities. Watch them go to the breakfast table. Watch them interact. Watch them talk. Watch them say goodbye. His purpose, initially, was to try and incorporate himself into a normal family routine. What he didn't have, and what he wanted to have. And that's how it starts. Now, obviously, it goes beyond that point, dramatically. But it's important to understand how it originates. The voyeurism is discovered when Danny's about 16. And regrettably, once again, instead of counseling, he receives a beating. So what we see is what the therapy that was used to deal with the voyeurism is in fact what was one of the causes for the onset of the voyeurism. So we have a vicious circle going on here. And in Danny's case, the voyeurism becomes a recognized psychological problem for him. Move on to Dr. McMahon. Dr. McMahon, as part of her testimony, is going to stress the effect of physical and emotional abuse on a child. Okay? First of all, I'll be asking Dr. McMahon, tell me, okay, what happens to the child who's abused? What's the effect on this person? Well, the first thing she will talk about deals with self-esteem, okay? Self-esteem, okay? A term that I used before in describing the characteristics of the borderline personality disorder. At this point, we're going to start seeing how this and this all come together. They have no value. They do not feel any self-esteem. Remember, I used that term before. We'll see it again. They feel like they are less than nothing because they've been treated as less than nothing. They have unhealthy self-images, or literally no image at all, and no self-worth. So lack of self-esteem, one of the big factors in development as an individual. Self-esteem. That's why we are so concerned about it in our early adult life and in our schools. Developing self-esteem. What else happens to the child who's abused? Well, they do not develop empathy. Oh, there's another term I mentioned before. Empathy. Remember, that's one of the other characteristics of the borderline. They do not understand empathy. Not that they don't want to give it. They just don't know anything about it. The child who is abused also lacks an understanding of empathy. The problem that they have is that it doesn't make any difference what they do. They realize that their behavior literally has no effect on the outcome of what happens to them. If they do good, if they do bad, if they do indifferent, the final result is the same, for them bad. So they do not see any effect from what they do. From this we see a breeding ground for antisocial conduct. Because it doesn't make any difference what you do. It'll be bad for you no matter what. The abused child does not know how to express emotions. Whoa, here's another one. Remember we talked about the ability of the borderline to try and express emotions. They do not know how to express emotion. Well, why? Because when they've tried to express emotion before, it's met with negative results. That's why they're abused. They do not know how to receive positive emotions because they've never had to deal with positive emotions before. They also develop what are called maladaptive coping skills. In other words, they don't know how to deal with anger. Once again, the seething rage that we talked about with the borderline. They don't know how to deal with anger and feeling bad. So they develop maladaptive coping mechanisms to deal with this. We're going to see this term come up again in just a few seconds. Their interpersonal relationships are very poor as abused children. Why? Because their initial relationships as children to adults was terrible. So they don't learn how to develop relationships with other people. Once again, where do we see that? Inability, socialization with relationships, borderline personality. In short, the effects of abuse literally dominate an individual's personality for the rest of their lives. Now, I asked you a question on what diet. Why do you think some people are able to overcome obstacles while others are not? Everyone had their opinion. I'm going to be asking the same question to Dr. Kropp, Dr. McMahon, Dr. Sale. And they will explain to you why. Depending on where you stand in relationship in the family, depending on a whole host of factors, and a variety of reasons. Why some people do and some people don't, and then we'll get into the specific, Mr. Rowling. Dr. McMahon will also talk about dissociative disorder. If you recall, I told you that at one point, Dr. McMahon also specializes in the area dealing with dissociative disorders. Dissociative disorder is an alteration in two functions of a human being, the consciousness and identity aspects of human beings. Dissociative disorder, a person's identity is temporarily forgotten, and a new identity is assumed, and that's not his case, or feelings of reality are somewhat lost, not a complete break, somewhat lost. And Dr. Mann will talk about Mr. Rowling's dissociative disorder because his is a relatively new concept of the dissociative disorder. In Mr. Rowling's case, he believes that he is possessed by spirits or demons that unconsciously act out forbidden acts. Now, I'm not saying this is the devil making me do it, okay? Please understand this. This is not what I'm trying to say. The concept of the demon working within him comes about primarily from an individual's religious background. Remember, when we're children, we all have concepts of the devil as we learn either from our parents or from religious teachings. So we have a concept of devils or demons. And this concept that we have is what we develop, or a dissociative person develops later on, and then attributes certain actions or conduct or behavior to the devil or the demon. As I said before, we're not using this as a defense. There is no defense in this case. Mr. Rowling's pled guilty, so it's not a defense. Second, you need to understand that although Mr. Rowling says his actions are influenced by these spirits, he in no way says that he doesn't remember doing it or he didn't do it. He admits it. Did it, know it, understand it, knew what he's doing. Okay? What these spirits represent or are for him under this dissociative disorder is basically a coping mechanism. They even have names, Gemini and Enad. You'll hear about that in the testimony. But what's happening, the dynamic that's going on here, is that there is a certain aspect about Mr. Rowling. Rage. We'll talk about that. He cannot understand, comprehend, or appreciate the nature and source or the existence of the rage and the acts that stem from it. So what you cannot accept, you attribute to some entity that is associated with this type of activity, the devil or demon. Once again, back to the religious understanding of, let's say, sin. So this becomes a coping mechanism for what he cannot understand, he attributes to a demon. This would be what we would call a maladaptive coping mechanism, which we talked about as one of the results of the characteristics of abuse. So this is where the maladaptive coping mechanisms come in. That basically will be the defense mitigation case in answer to why. These witnesses provide the cause. These witnesses provide the effect. And regrettably, you see the result. But at least you see a why. In closing, the state is going to present evidence that at the very least is gut-wrenching. Believe me, I know, I've seen it. I can't argue that it's not. It's going to be. And I am concerned because there is mitigation in this case. Strong mitigation. Mitigation that speaks of in one's life. But my concern is that you see the state's case and you have an emotional reaction such that you shut down and shut out the defense case. Remember, Mr. Smith was chiding you, reminding you that please don't leap to any conclusions or don't stop listening. You have to see the whole picture. Well, here's half the picture. And my concern is do you have the strength enough to look at the other half of the picture? At the time you're listening to testimony presented by the state, I would hope each and every one of you would have a little voice that says, I'm looking at it, but I want to know why. Because in why, there's mitigation. And in mitigation, we argue for a life sentence. Thank you very much.